Picture this. It's May 19th, 1536, and a heavy mist clings to the Tower of London like a burial shroud. Within those ancient stone walls, something extraordinary is about to happen, something so chilling that witnesses will whisper about it in hushed voices for the rest of their lives. A queen is about to lose her head, but what happens next will defy everything we thought we knew about death itself. But to understand this terrifying moment that will haunt history for nearly 5 centuries, we must first journey back 29 years to when Anne Boleyn was just a young girl with dangerous dreams that would reshape an entire kingdom. Born sometime between 1501 and 1507, even her birth year remains shrouded in mystery, as if fate itself wanted to keep her origins secret. Anne Boleyn entered a brutal world where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and utterly invisible. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a merchant's son who had clawed his way into the nobility through shrewd politics, strategic marriages, and an almost supernatural ability to read the shifting winds of royal favor. He understood power in its rawest form, and he understood something even more crucial, that his daughters were valuable currency in the deadly game of court politics. At barely 12 years old, imagine the child that age today. Anne was torn away from everything familiar and safe. First, she was shipped off to the Netherlands like a piece of precious cargo, then to the glittering, dangerous court of France, where she would serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude. Picture a young girl separated from her family, thrust into a world where speaking the wrong word to the wrong person could mean exile, imprisonment, or even death. She had to learn to survive in an environment where every smile hid a dagger and every compliment masked a threat. But France changed Anne in ways her calculating father never anticipated. In those grand palaces along the Loire Valley, she witnessed something that would prove revolutionary and ultimately fatal. French queens who actually ruled. These weren't the silent, submissive wives that English tradition demanded. They didn't just bear children and fade gracefully into the background. They influenced foreign policy, commanded armies, wielded real political power, and most dangerously of all, they were respected for their intelligence. Anne absorbed these radical lessons like a sponge soaking up water, never imagining that this foreign education would one day become the evidence used to sign her death warrant. When she returned to England in 1522, Anne brought with her something far more dangerous than expensive French fashions or continental mannerisms. She carried a revolutionary understanding of what a woman could become. She spoke fluent French with the accent of nobility, played multiple musical instruments with professional skill, danced with the grace of a born aristocrat, and possessed a sharp, questioning intelligence that both attracted and deeply threatened every man who encountered her. In Tudor England, these accomplishments weren't considered virtues in a woman, they were warning signs of dangerous ambition that needed to be crushed before it could spread. Anne's romantic life began like the most enchanting fairy tale, but quickly descended into a nightmare that any modern woman would recognize with uncomfortable familiarity. Her first documented serious relationship was with Henry VIII, heir to one of England's most ancient and powerful families. They met at court functions, fell passionately and genuinely in love, and secretly became engaged with all the desperate intensity of young people who believe love can conquer anything. It should have been the beginning of a beautiful love story, but this was Tudor England, where love was a luxury that only the powerless could afford, and even then, only in secret. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister and a man who wielded power like a surgeon wields a scalpel, discovered their engagement through his network of spies and informants. He destroyed their relationship with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had crushed dozens of similar romances before. Percy was immediately summoned to London, threatened with the loss of his inheritance, and forced to marry Elizabeth Talbot, a woman chosen entirely by his family for political advantage. Anne was publicly humiliated in front of the entire court, dismissed from service, and sent home to her family's estate in disgrace. The message carved into her heart was crystal clear. Your emotions, your body, your future, your very soul, none of it belongs to you.
Most women of the era would have learned the intended lesson from this brutal experience. Accept your powerlessness, marry whoever your family chooses, and disappear quietly into domestic obscurity. But Anne Boleyn learned something entirely different and infinitely more dangerous. Instead of accepting her place in the rigid social hierarchy, she decided she would master the game of power better than any man who had ever played it. Enter Henry VIII, a man who, by any modern standard, would have every woman in Europe running for the nearest exit. At 35, he was already notorious as a serial adulterer who collected mistresses the way other men collected hunting trophies. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain who had been a faithful, devoted wife for over 15 years. But marital vows had never stopped Henry from pursuing whatever woman caught his royal fancy. What made Anne Boleyn different from all his previous conquests was her strategy. When the King of England himself began his pursuit, she did something that was not just unprecedented, but seemed almost suicidal. She looked him directly in the eye and said no. "I would rather lose my life than my virtue," she reportedly told him during one of their early encounters. In an age where kings took whatever they wanted without question or consequence, Anne Boleyn was setting boundaries. She was demanding marriage, commitment, and respect, not just a position as another royal mistress to be used and discarded when the king grew bored. For 7 long, agonizing years, Anne kept the most powerful man in Europe chasing her like a lovesick schoolboy. Henry showered her with gifts that would bankrupt small kingdoms: jeweled necklaces, imported silk gowns, rare books, even entire estates. He wrote passionate love letters in his own hand, something kings simply didn't do. He promised her the moon, the stars, and the crown of England itself. To our modern eyes, familiar with the psychology of abusive relationships, it looks like textbook love bombing. That overwhelming flood of attention, gifts, and promises that narcissists use to capture and control their targets. Henry's surviving letters to Anne reveal a man who was obsessed, possessive, and growing increasingly unstable with each passing month of rejection. He wrote, "I beseech you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind is to the love between us two." This wasn't the language of partnership or mutual respect. It was the desperate demand of someone who saw Anne not as an individual with her own thoughts and feelings, but as a beautiful object to be acquired, possessed, and controlled. In 1533, after years of this dangerous courtship, Anne finally surrendered. They were married in a secret ceremony, and she became Queen of England in one of the most lavish coronations in English history. Standing in Westminster Abbey, wearing a crown that had belonged to queens for centuries, Anne must have thought she had achieved the impossible. She had won the ultimate prize in the game of power. She had no idea that in accepting Henry's crown, she had just signed her own death warrant in the king's own hand. To marry Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII didn't just break a few rules. He literally shattered England into pieces and rebuilt it according to his desires. He divorced Catherine of Aragon, a woman beloved by the common people and respected throughout Europe. He severed England's centuries-old ties with the Catholic Church, declaring himself head of a new Church of England. He dissolved hundreds of monasteries, seizing their vast wealth and lands. The Pope excommunicated Henry, making him a pariah in Christian Europe. Foreign kings threatened invasion to restore the true queen. The country teetered on the edge of civil war. All of this chaos, all of this destruction, all of these earth-shaking changes for Anne Boleyn.
But Anne made a fatal miscalculation that would doom her from the very beginning of her reign. She wasn't content to be a decorative queen who smiled, waved, and stayed silent. She had passionate opinions about foreign policy, religious reform, court appointments, and government spending. She read banned Protestant books and discussed theology with religious reformers. She influenced Henry's decisions on matters of state. She acted like what she believed she was, a queen who had the right and responsibility to actually rule alongside her husband. The established court despised her for this unprecedented behavior. Traditional Catholics saw her as a dangerous heretic who had corrupted their king and led him into damnation. The old nobility resented her merchant-class background and her family's rapid rise to power. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings that Anne was universally hated by the common people, who still mourned the discarded Catherine of Aragon and saw Anne as nothing more than a scheming homewrecker who had destroyed a good woman's life.
Anne had one trump card that could have silenced all criticism and secured her position forever: pregnancy. If she could give Henry the legitimate male heir he had been desperately seeking for over 20 years, all her other faults would be forgiven and forgotten. The entire kingdom held its breath as Anne's pregnancy progressed through the summer of 1533. On September 7th at Greenwich Palace, Anne gave birth to a healthy, beautiful child with a remarkable resemblance to her father, a daughter, Elizabeth. In that moment, watching her red-haired baby girl take her first breath and cry with lusty strength, Anne Boleyn unknowingly sealed her own fate. Henry had risked his kingdom, his soul, and his international reputation for the promise of a son, and Anne had failed him in the most fundamental way possible. The transformation in Henry's behavior was immediate and terrifying. The love letters stopped arriving. The private dinners ended abruptly. The expensive gifts disappeared. The king's obsession began curdling into something far more dangerous than mere disappointment. It was becoming active disgust. By early 1536, Anne was watching her carefully constructed world collapse piece by piece like a house built on sand. Henry was openly courting Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, conducting his new romance literally under his wife's nose. The ultimate betrayal, being replaced by someone from your own household, someone who had eaten at your table and sworn loyalty to your service. Any sensible woman would have retreated gracefully, accepted the inevitable, and tried to negotiate the best possible terms for her future. But Anne Boleyn had never been sensible, and pride had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. Instead of retreating, Anne fought back with all the fury of a woman who had sacrificed everything for a crown she now saw slipping away. She confronted Henry about his affair in front of other courtiers. She demanded he dismiss Jane Seymour from court immediately. She threatened to expose embarrassing secrets about his private habits and political dealings. She reminded him, with cutting sarcasm, of all the promises he had made when he was pursuing her. What was she thinking during those final desperate months? Perhaps she believed that her crown offered some protection, that even Henry wouldn't dare harm an anointed queen. Or perhaps she was simply too proud, too intelligent, and too strong-willed to beg for mercy from a man who had proven himself to be both a coward and a tyrant.
Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthlessly efficient chief minister, had been watching Anne's downward spiral with the patient attention of a spider waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had his own compelling reasons for wanting the queen destroyed. They had clashed repeatedly over religious policy. Anne wanted England to ally with Protestant German princes, while Cromwell preferred maintaining connections with Catholic France. Anne had insisted that wealth seized from dissolved monasteries should be distributed to the poor and used for education, while Cromwell wanted it flowing directly into the royal treasury. Most dangerously of all, Anne had begun questioning Cromwell's growing influence over her husband, suggesting that perhaps the chief minister was accumulating too much power for a man of his humble origins. In early 1536, Cromwell made his move with the devastating efficiency of a master strategist who had been planning this campaign for months. He began systematically collecting evidence of Anne's adultery, charges so outrageous and physically impossible that they bordered on fantasy. 5 men were accused of being the Queen's lovers, including Mark Smeaton, a talented court musician, Henry Norris, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, William Brereton, another court official, Sir Francis Weston, a young courtier, and most shockingly of all, George Boleyn, Anne's own beloved brother. The alleged affairs supposedly occurred during times when Anne was visibly pregnant, recovering from miscarriages, or participating in public ceremonies with hundreds of witnesses. The supposed rendezvous were said to have taken place in locations where privacy would have been impossible. The witnesses who testified against her had been tortured, bribed, or threatened with their own execution if they didn't cooperate. But Thomas Cromwell understood something crucial about Tudor politics that modern people often forget. Truth didn't matter nearly as much as perception, and fear could make people believe almost anything. On April 30th, 1536, Mark Smeaton was arrested without warning and taken to Cromwell's private residence, where he was tortured for hours until he finally confessed to adultery with Queen Anne. Once Cromwell had that first confession, the machinery of destruction began moving with unstoppable momentum. May 2nd, 1536, dawned bright and clear, with spring sunshine streaming through the windows of Greenwich Palace. Anne was in the royal box watching a tournament, smiling and waving to the crowds, probably enjoying what would be her last few moments of freedom and happiness. Suddenly, everything changed. Royal guards surrounded the Queen's box, and she was arrested in front of hundreds of shocked spectators. One moment she was Queen of England, graciously presiding over court entertainment. The next moment she was a prisoner accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The speed and public nature of her arrest were entirely intentional. Cromwell wanted to ensure that no one had time to organize a defense, rally supporters, or question the evidence too closely. Anne was immediately taken to the Tower of London, the same ancient fortress where she had stayed in luxury and excitement before her coronation just 3 years earlier. Now, those same stone walls had become her prison, and everyone who saw her enter knew with cold certainty that she would never leave alive. Inside the tower, Anne faced the full horror of her impossible situation. Men who had once bowed respectfully to her and competed for her favor now testified against her with detailed accounts of supposed crimes. Her trial was nothing more than political theater, a carefully choreographed performance designed to provide a thin veneer of legal justification for a predetermined outcome. The peers who sat in judgment included Henry VIII, her first love, now forced by political necessity to condemn the woman he had once wanted to marry.
Throughout the proceedings, Anne maintained her innocence with dignity that impressed even her enemies. She was eloquent, composed, and absolutely defiant. She knew with certainty that she was going to die, but she refused to confess to crimes she hadn't committed, even when promised a quicker, more merciful death in exchange for admission of guilt. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was formally condemned to death for adultery, incest, and high treason against the crown. But here's where our story takes its most mysterious and disturbing turn. Henry VIII made a decision that broke with centuries of English, legal, and cultural tradition. Instead of the standard execution method for English traitors, beheading with an axe on the public scaffold of Tower Hill, he imported a professional swordsman from Calais in France. The official explanation was mercy. A sword was supposedly quicker, cleaner, and more humane than the traditional axe. But was there another, darker motive lurking behind this unusual arrangement? Did Henry have special plans for Anne's remains? Why break with established tradition for this particular execution? On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn dressed for her death with the same meticulous care she had once used for state occasions. She chose a gray damask gown with an ermine mantle, simple but unmistakably regal, every inch a queen preparing for her final, most important performance. Her last words, delivered to the small crowd of witnesses, were unnaturally calm and diplomatically careful. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord." She knelt upright on the scaffold, her dark eyes covered with a simple blindfold, her lips moving in silent prayer. The French executioner, whose name history has forgotten, raised his sword with professional precision. In one swift, perfect stroke, Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body. And then something extraordinary happened, something so disturbing that witnesses would wake up screaming about it for years afterward. After the sword completed its work, Anne's severed head showed unmistakable signs of consciousness. Her lips continued moving for several long seconds, as if she was desperately trying to speak. Her eyes opened and closed repeatedly, seeming to focus on faces in the crowd.
Some witnesses swore they saw her mouth forming words, struggling to communicate some final, crucial message that the world desperately needed to hear. But here's where our mystery truly begins, and where the story becomes genuinely chilling. In every other Tudor execution for treason, the severed heads were displayed publicly as gruesome warnings to potential rebels. They were tarred to preserve them, mounted on iron spikes, and exhibited on London Bridge for months or even years, slowly rotting in full view of everyone who crossed the Thames. It was a deliberate, calculated terror tactic designed to remind the population of the price of defying royal authority.
Anne Boleyn's head simply vanished. No public display, no spike on London Bridge, no preservation as a warning to other potential traitors. Her head disappeared from historical record as completely as if it had never existed. Her body was hastily and unceremoniously stuffed into an old elm chest, not even a proper coffin, and buried without ceremony in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds. But her head, the head that had supposedly tried to speak after death, was nowhere to be found. Why would Henry VIII break with such a fundamental tradition? What was he so desperately afraid that Anne's severed head might reveal if people could see it? What secret was he willing to risk political embarrassment to keep buried forever? The most compelling theory suggests that Anne's head was secretly preserved and later reburied by her daughter Elizabeth I when she became queen 22 years later. Consider the beautiful, tragic justice of this possibility. Elizabeth would have had both the absolute power and the deeply personal motivation to give her murdered mother the dignified burial she had been denied. Some historians believe that Elizabeth quietly arranged for Anne's head to be reunited with her body in a secret midnight ceremony, finally granting her mother the respect and peace that Henry's paranoia had stolen. Other researchers propose that the head was hidden away entirely, carefully preserved as potential evidence of Henry's crimes or kept as insurance against future political accusations. In those dangerous times, when royal favor could shift overnight and today's favorite could become tomorrow's traitor, physical proof of a king's brutality might prove valuable to those brave or foolish enough to preserve it. When Queen Victoria ordered extensive renovations to the Tower Chapel in the 19th century, workers discovered skeletal remains that were believed to belong to Anne Boleyn, but without the skull, conclusive identification proved impossible, and the mystery only deepened with each passing generation. The truth is that nearly 500 years later, we still don't know what happened to Anne Boleyn's head. But perhaps that's strangely appropriate for a woman who refused to be silenced in life and seems determined to keep us guessing in death. Perhaps the missing head is Anne's final act of defiance against a king who tried to erase her from history. What we do know with certainty is that Henry VIII's attempt to destroy Anne's memory and legacy failed more completely than he could ever have imagined. The woman he tried so desperately to forget became the mother of England's greatest monarch. Elizabeth I would rule for 45 glorious years, transforming England from a small, relatively insignificant kingdom into a world power that would dominate the seas and colonize continents. Under Elizabeth's rule, England experienced a golden age of art, literature, exploration, and scientific discovery that still influences our world today. So the next time you think about the Tower of London, remember Anne Boleyn. Remember that somewhere within those ancient blood-soaked stones lies the body of a queen who changed the entire course of English history. And remember that her head, wherever it may be, took with it secrets that powerful men were willing to commit murder to keep hidden. The mystery of Anne Boleyn's missing head may never be solved, but perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some truths are too dangerous to be buried, too important to be forgotten, and too powerful to be silenced, even by death itself.